Hello, I am Kevin Carter, Director of Corporate Communications at Everbridge, and I'm really excited to kick off a panel which I think is top of mind for a lot of people. It's entitled Human Resources, the Response to the COVID-19 Pandemic and the Future of the Workplace. I'm very, very excited to welcome both Beth Grouse, who is the Chief People Officer of TripAdvisor, a travel planning website. She looks after everything from the workplace to retail. I'm also very excited to welcome Nada Usina, who is the Managing Director and member of the Executive Committee for the Technology Practice of Russell Reynolds Associates, which is an executive search firm and advisory firm. Thank you both very much for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
We'll kick off with our first question. So this first question is for Nada. When did you first realize, what was the turning point where you realized the COVID-19 pandemic was going to be unlike anything that you'd ever managed in your career and in your lifetime?
It's a great question, Kevin. Thank you. I would say, it was a bit of a crescendo. As a global firm, we have offices in 47 countries around the world, and it really began to come to light for us throughout Asia, which afforded us a bit of a preview into how to potentially handle this from a global perspective. And through the work that we do with our clients, that was another lens into this across industry and across sector. So as that began, I recall sitting in our New York office, we were having our quarterly executive committee meeting, and we were talking through the potential implications, what it might mean for us in the rest of the world. That very quickly, over a matter of days, escalated into having an office that is going to be closed in London, in Connecticut, and wherever it may be. And I think the real difference here that everyone has probably experienced at some level is truly the human impact beyond control. This is not about furloughs or layoffs, it's about humanity and the impact to people's lives and the deaths that have occurred as a result. So really ensuring that we are prepared and helping our clients prepare from an emotional perspective, not just from a financial perspective, but that has been a crescendo from really the beginning of the year till today.
Thank you. And Beth, the same question for you. When did you know, what was the turning point for you?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So similar to Nada, TripAdvisor has offices in countries around the globe. We have 52 offices in more than 20 countries. So we started seeing early signs of this in Asia. But I think for me, there were two moments where it became very clear, and they were within days of each other. One was it was a Sunday, it was either March 8th or March 9th, when we had an emergency conference call with a number of us about closing our offices in Italy because that country had just closed the borders. And we were like, literally all of us on the phone were like, whoa, what just happened? And as we started to see the virus sort of go from east to west, and as we headed into the US, we sort of scrambled around that Monday morning. And one of the things that was very clear to us is that we needed to know where our employees, not just where they were, but where they had been. We weren't doing a lot of business travel at that point for the pandemic, but we knew employees had been doing a fair amount of personal travel. And so we launched a form to track the form so we would know who we would need to ask to self-quarantine, et cetera. And within 12 hours of launching that form, we had 450 responses from employees. And that was the moment where we looked at ourselves collectively and said, we just have to close all of our offices because we're eating the elephant at the wrong end. That was the conversation in that moment, that we just realized that this was quite unlike anything we'd seen. And then, of course, for us, it goes without saying that as a travel website that also has a fairly large restaurant business, La Fourchette, or otherwise known as The Fork in Europe, the impact of the virus on our business was profound and immediate. So I think unlike some other industries, the travel and restaurant hospitality industry, sort of came to a screeching halt almost overnight around the globe. And It was, I think, quite clear to us that this was on a humanitarian level, on a public health level, on an employee level, on a business level, just going to be totally uncharted waters that we were in and we were going to be in for some time.
Thank you, Beth. As long as we're with you, Beth, I have a follow-up question, which is, how did communication or the role of communication play in your initial response to the crisis?
Yeah, it's a great question because with offices around the globe spanning 18 to 20 hours of time zone, using things like, frankly, the Everbridge tool to alert our employees on their mobile phones, particularly in those countries where there's not a always on to email culture, to push notifications out to say, check your email. We have emerging news, like real-time news about whether your office is going to be open or closed. We launched a number of electronic tools to be in two-way communication with our employees. We got physically together as teams and sort of quickly scrambled to put a plan in place that was more robust than what we had thought and more quickly than we had thought. And then I think, the importance for us of real-time transparent communication with the global workforce, with customers, but particularly for our employees to say, here's what we know, here's what we don't. We're going to keep communicating, and here are our guiding principles. We're going to keep you safe. We are going to make thoughtful decisions. We may move more slowly than you might be used to make sure that we get it right. And if we don't think we've got it right, we're going to undo that. And so we still, to this day, we're probably, 10, 11 weeks in at this point, probably communicating with our workforce in the form of town halls and other communications at a multiple of how we have ever communicated with them. It's really been the cornerstone of what I think has not only gotten us through, but has enabled us to stay productive, which has been really remarkable.
Thank you. On that note of productivity, Nada, what kinds of communications are going on now? I imagine employees are looking for updates and things. How are you currently communicating with your staff?
Yeah, I think it is, as Beth stated, a lot about frequency and fluidity as the circumstances are evolving, as more information is coming through. And really it's around transparency. But I'll share perhaps even beyond our own firm, which certainly has a great global footprint, because we are working with so many organizations around the world, across industry and across sector. We do end up seeing a pretty broad perspective of approaches. And I think very consistently, the mobilization around communications of these organizations has been tremendous. I think the ability for executive teams to step up through this moment and provide not just the group Zoom calls or all hands meetings, but the amount of high touch that has happened in a one-on-one facilitation is something that I think has really stood out for us in terms of our observation. The piece around how our companies reacting here, it does sort of go to a different question where in some cases there were parts of a business that perhaps might have been cracking a little bit before. Oftentimes something like this will put a magnifying glass on it and it will cause some pretty major cracks. And this is not about whether the leisure hospitality world is on it upended or whether the oil and gas industry has had a challenge, but it's how are those executives reacting and communicating in this moment in time, and having sort of the empathy as well as the mobilization that's required.
Thank you. And what are some examples of someone doing that right? Like in the sense of what are the best practices?
Well, I've probably talked to dozens of chairs and CEOs of companies. I help lead our technology sector globally for the firm. And, it's an industry that for the most part is often viewed as disrupting things and leading things in the world. But in many cases, the cobbler's children have no shoes. And so for the first time, these are organizations that are having to work remote. I spoke with the chair the other day of a very sizable tech organization who said, if you'd asked me 5 or 6 months ago, could I envision our company operating effectively remotely? They're doing at about a 98% capacity today. You would have said I was crazy. But today, what I can't envision is how we come back to the old way of working. And in fact, while many of these leaders are looking to be first in so many capacities, the one thing they are not en masse looking to be first to do is to come back to the office as it was once viewed, but rather really spending time on thinking through how can they be effective in a more remote and flexible setting.
Thank you. I'd like to touch upon remote work in a bit more depth in a minute, but before I get to that, Beth, I'm curious, as you look back on either TripAdvisor or other companies' response to the crisis, what do you think companies have done well, or what's worked well, and what might have either TripAdvisor or other companies, what should they have done differently?
Yeah, I think there's hindsight is wonderful, and you always can can benefit from it. And I think certainly for us, and I don't think we're alone in this. Being having your finger on the pulse of what was happening and being unafraid to be bold in closing offices, making the tough calls, making decisions that really were unprecedented. I mean, just to give folks listening to this context, TripAdvisor had never even closed for a snow day, truly. Or any other kind of related incident. Our offices have just always remained open, and that was very, very much part of the culture.
Well, you're headquartered in Boston, so you don't address snow days?
I know, but we don't close the office. We tell people, hey, listen, if it's easier for you to work remote, but we've just never had a culture of fully shutting down. Even though we've had a lot of snow in some very recent years. And so, I think for companies to really kind of unleash themselves from the old norms and the old way of doing things and recognize that what might have worked for you then doesn't work for you now. And I think the more companies that have been able to do that around this crisis and be bold and know what they don't know and reach out for help. For me, one of the really wonderful things of this crisis is seeing how many leaders and executives, whether they're HR leaders or other leaders, are coming together in community and sharing information in a way that I couldn't have imagined prior to this crisis. What are you doing for severance? How are you thinking about reopening? Are you asking employees to wear masks in the office? How are you thinking about your workforce that needs to take public transportation? When are you reopening? And there is this sort of, wonderful collaboration that I see happening cross-industry, cross-functionally, that has really been wonderful. If you were to ask me the things we did well, I think we communicated and we made the calls that we needed to make to close the offices. If I had to do it over again, I would have done it even sooner. But we are where we are, and I think, most companies, frankly, have stepped up pretty admirably in the handling of this, at least in my view.
Thank you. Beth, I know you handle everything from, the workplace to retail. Can you help us get a sense of the level of complexity it took to kind of make those quick changes, change over to a remote workforce overnight through the eyes or the lens of someone in human resources or a human resources executive like yourself?
Yeah, thanks. So similar to the comment that Nada made, I almost wondered if she was talking about us when she said, there was a certain senior leader that she'd been speaking with that if you'd asked her 6 months ago, she would have never envisioned that company going fully remote, and here they are. And, and that was us as well. We are just, we're not a fully remote culture. And so I think, and we literally went fully remote around the world within about 36 hours. And I think first, what enabled that was we had the technology to do it. So we had the right tools and the right systems and the right infrastructure in place that when we loaded it with 100% of our workforce, it held up and it was robust. So that was great. Secondly, we have spent a lot of time in listening mode with our people, asking them, how's it going? How's your productivity? What do you need? Is this working? What do we need to know to make this more effective? We just deployed a survey, actually, it's really timely, earlier this week, and fully 85% of our workforce this week has told us they are as productive or more productive at home and working remotely than they were in an office. And in fact, managers believe the same of their teams. So that, I think, is a real paradigm shift for us around remote work and some of the complexities that outside of a crisis you wouldn't, you might have thought were insurmountable, like how do customer support agents who are dealing with PII and credit cards do that at home? How do we move sales, where there's an infrastructure around people? How do we move it at home? When you have a crisis, you just kind of do it and you figure it out. And I think, we've jokingly sort of said to each other, and I'm sure many of your clients have said the same to themselves, like, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Like, use it as an opportunity to think about total reinvention and swinging for the fences and making calls that you, in a different, more stable world, would never have even thought of. But now's the time to be bold.
That's actually a great segue. Oh, go ahead, Nada, please.
No, I was saying well said. And no, Beth, it wasn't you all, but not surprised.
I was going to say that's an excellent segue into a question we received. So Nada, Twitter recently announced that its employees can work from home indefinitely. Do you believe remote work is here to stay permanently and sort of in this, in a way where corporations really embrace it wholeheartedly?
Yeah, I think it's definitely here to stay. The conversations, and Beth, you've been a part of several of these as we've brought together cohorts of senior CHROs and chief people officers around industries and sectors. In the temporary, it's many employees sort of going back to their homes, truly to their parents' homes, even if they're early out of school, et cetera. And they're very happy to allow that employee to be productive in Lexington, Kentucky versus Silicon Valley. The issue is a pragmatic one, which is, do we have the ability to do it in Kentucky, right? So there's some very basic sort of pragmatic things that need to get sorted through and will get sorted through. The bigger question that we've been spending a lot of time with boards and C-suite around is, how then do you continue to build a culture in a virtual environment? What are you looking to do in that longer term? And what will that culture mean to you going forward? So absolutely, I think there's much more flexibility. And honestly, from just a capital perspective, real estate, et cetera, even in talking to some of the work share types of environments, think the WeWorks of the world, the evolution of what has been happening from sort of corporate space was already underway. This is now an acceleration. So ensuring that there is, healthness, safety first, productivity for sure, but culture is the real sort of dialogue right now.
That's an excellent point, Nada. And I'd actually love to address that to Beth as well. So when virtually all of your employees are working from home, how do you continue to foster strong culture and productivity as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and maybe I'll start by just sort of echoing Nada's comments that I do think that remote work is here to stay. We've had a very strong culture actually around our physical space, around our physical offices. They've been very much a purposeful manifestation of our culture, and they are built in, or at least historically have built in ways like in our headquarters with a world cuisine free cafeteria that not only reflects the kind of world travel business that we're in, but also reflects the fact that we want people to be in community, sitting, being together, breaking bread, socializing, being with one another. All of that is like turned entirely on its head with this pandemic. And we've had to completely reimagine, how do we think about physical space? How much physical space should we have around the world? What's the purpose of an office, at least in the sort of mid to near term? And is that the same purpose as it is in the long term? And I think, and all of that feeds to the culture question. And to be quite candid, we're not there yet. Like, we haven't figured out exactly how to do this right. I think we're sort of feeling our way. Our headlights are a few feet ahead of us, and we're, sort of driving slowly across the country with, that much light. But what we do know is that, this creates a real opportunity for us to really rethink, how do we use our physical space? How much money do we spend on our physical space? What is the purpose of an office? And I do think that offices will still continue to have a purpose, But it will need to be very, very deliberate around bringing people together around certain projects, around certain engagements, around culture, around community. But no longer will there be this sort of de facto expectation that, well, everyone gets in their, however they transport themselves to the office Monday through Friday, do that as they've always done. I think that many employees around the globe have very much relished the opportunity to work remotely. Some have not. There are people at home saying, we had a full 15% of people in our survey this week say, get me back to the office. I'm in a cramped city apartment with 3 roommates, and this is not working for me. So there'll always be that balance. And, I think for us, it is really we think about this sort of purposeful bringing people together as we're slowly able to come back, and then to bring, frankly, our employees together to talk about how do we collectively reinvent this together.
Yep. So that's actually a fantastic topic. Nada, from your perspective, what does the future of the office look like? And, is there an office? Does that factor into the future of how we work?
Yeah, I think to Beth's point, there is still going to be some sort of centralized environment in which people operate, but depending on the business in which you're in, you may have been working in a plant, right? And so when we think about what's happening in the world of technology, automation has certainly been on the cusp or already enabled in many environments. I think that will continue to accelerate it. The conversation we've been having with a number of boards around the world, if you can imagine, boards have had a lot of interest in bringing people, for example, from the technology sector into their boardroom, be it industrial companies or consumer companies or healthcare companies. And the idea of taking a gainfully employed CEO from Silicon Valley to travel 8 times a year to Europe or Australia for a board that they perhaps would have deep intellectual interest in just was not as pragmatic. And in speaking to a couple of chairs of a similar ilk, they've said, we've re-envisioned what that might look like. It might be a couple of meetings per year in person around an annual general meeting. Even those are taking place virtually, but the others may take place in a more remote type of environment or even a clustered environment around certain regions. So there will be, I think, still certainly a need for community. And that community does include, if you read many studies, it is physical, it is emotional, it can be virtual, certainly, but there's a combination therein that will depend on the circumstance and the setting. It will depend on the environment. But I do think that probably the key word is going to be flexibility or agility. And we've seen that happen, Beth, as you said, in 36 hours, you sort of took the whole company remote. And while many others may have taken a longer period of time, nonetheless, they've been forced to go there. And so how are other decisions being made in a more flexible fashion? The physical is one of those, but even in our business, which is often a very high-end, high-touch sort of recruiting environment of, sitting public company CEOs or private equity-backed environments, and getting those people connected is happening so much more rapidly now than it would have in the past, where it took 3 weeks to schedule a flight and so on and so forth. So I think it's going to be pragmatic, coupled with flexibility that helps determine when and where, and to Beth's point, why a physical environment is necessitated.
And maybe just to add, maybe just to add, Bree, the things that we're finding also is that regardless of how devastating this pandemic has been to many sectors of the economy, there still is an employment market for really good talent out there. And that's a fact, and maybe a surprising fact, more so than we thought at this point. But if I think about a company like ours reaching out to key talent, the ability to be flexible and to people where they're at, if remote work is something that now appeals to them, is really, I think, an obligation of companies to consider actively. How do you meet your talent sort of where they are, rather than saying, here's our framework and either you fit into it or you don't, because many people, particularly if they're facing care issues, elder care issues, child care issues, the uncertainty of schools and other care options for some number of many months, will want to know that a company understands and supports the need for flexible work and at every level. And I think that, certainly in our organization, we've seen a light speed, rapid evolution of the sort of people, leaders embracing that as a key both attraction and retention lever for all of our talent.
Thanks, Beth. Does that open up the aperture of the talent that a company like yours can recruit? For example, in the past, a company might have said, we only want people, we're only recruiting people in the New York City area because that's where we're based. Now our company's free to look for people who might be based in other parts of the country, away from where the office is based.
Yeah, and I think so. And I mean, we've certainly actively talked about the, I like to look at the world as a pretty glass that's pretty half full. And so, rather than bemoaning the fact that we're all apart, saying, okay, like how can we use this to our advantage as we look across town? So I think for sure it will. Nada mentioned this earlier. There are some practical considerations like, do you have a to be set up in a country? Can you deliver payroll in a certain state? The company just understand there's a little bit of infrastructure, but I do think that it will allow us to be much more flexible and open-minded about where we look, and that's really good.
Mm-hmm. And Nada, when Russell Reynolds is looking at recruiting executives in a largely remote world right now, what are the best practices to ensure that executive is able to connect with the right people when they're ramping up at a new organization and can be successful and thrive? What advice do you give them in this type of environment?
Yeah, I think there's actually a number of sort of dynamics leading up to that as well, which is the recruitment, and what you're talking about is the onboarding of that executive, each of which has its own sort of milestones that may be real or emotional or somewhere, across a spectrum of views. And I think the reality of when somebody is on board, that is already an indication that the company has expressed a willingness to take that leap. So taking that leap is another step I'll go to in a second. But once they've made that leap, in fact, I spoke to a very senior executive who moved from Silicon Valley to Singapore to work in a major organization, direct report to the CEO, a very tight-knit organization there. And the comment she made was that it's actually afforded her a more level playing field to be able to connect with other executives, because a lot of it is introductory, but then it's not a separate conversation happening. Rather, you can see very transparently who's talking to who and where, through calendars, et cetera, as opposed to, got invited to this meeting or was able to geographically fly to all of these places to see people. So it's accelerated the curve in some cases. I think in others, they are challenged, if they have not had a distributed footprint in the past. And, what we are advising people to do is really to continue to, as they typically would, invest the time, but recognize that it is going to take even more time. It's simple things. When you're on a Zoom, people have a certain perspective of you. We're seeing our upper bodies. We don't see our lower bodies right now, thankfully, because the pajama wearing that's going on around the world is hilarious. But getting a sense of somebody's presence themselves, going into a personal conversation, and really connecting, I think, is something that we continue to encourage. Standing up, walking around, people see your space, they get a sense of you. It is allowing for a personal connection, which actually in a way is more intimate when somebody is operating for their home and you see what's on their wall or behind in their office versus in their corporate office, which feels relatively corporate. So it can spark other conversations, but the sort of rigor by which people are doing it is something that we've encouraged. Once is not enough. And typically you would feel like once may be enough because virtually you sort of see people if you're in the office physically. Now you don't. So you are forced to actually drive that behavior.
Thank you for that. Beth, along those lines, are there any other tips or advice you recommend for increasing that human connection when either we're working remotely because of lockdowns or quarantines, or in the future, as you say, as the office gets more flexible and more people may be out of the physical building? How can we instill that sense of human connection, which is so important in a company?
Yeah. Yeah, as I listen to you ask this question, Kevin, I reflect on what my calendar has looked like over the last 8 weeks. And it's been a lot of meetings, many of them shorter than they normally would have been. So, you take an executive leadership team meeting that's normally 2.5 hours and it becomes 3 1-hour meetings or 6 half-hour meetings or what have you. But it's been mostly work. And it's been mostly work, A, because there's been a lot of work going on, and B, because we mostly know each other. But I think we can't lose the sense that particularly as Nana's talking about is we're onboarding new people, that what we miss right now, one of the things we miss right now being out of the office is the opportunity to bump into someone at the salad bar in the cafeteria and say, hey, how was your weekend? Or pass them in the hall and say, oh, I'm so glad I just ran into you, let's have this quick conversation. Or even I like your shoes, and which sometimes sparks a dialogue. And so I think we will have to be very deliberate about creating those moments for connection, where there's not a business agenda, where it's just around the human connection. And I think, I've been on so many Zoom or Blue Jeans calls in the last several weeks where, there's been kids and dogs and delivery people and, and people have gone from being like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, to sort of a shared laugh and that life and family. I also think, just getting up and changing scene. I mean, I try to move around my home for my various meetings because it's good for me. And it's interesting for the people who I speak with to see a different background and say, oh, where are you? So it's not the same old. I mean, I normally have a very tiny desk in my basement and I work down there because it's quite quiet most days, but it's very unattractive. Today, I'm coming to you from my dining room. And, later today, I'll probably be in another space in the house. And so for me, that also keeps me from getting sort of in a rut. And I think it also helps others from it as well. And I'm just, really personally trying to make human connections with people, and sometimes just call people and say, there's no business agenda here. I just want to check in and say, what's going on? How you doing? What are you doing for the weekend?
The one other thing I will just add is, and you mentioned earlier, Beth, never sort of take an opportunity, I guess, in a crisis to drive certain things that may not have been the case in the past. And I think when you have a crisis, especially at the executive level, where we see people coming together much more frequently, sometimes for pragmatic reasons, they're having to work through what are the sort of fiscal implications of, sales or no sales happening this month, the team, the rifts, the furloughs. When you go through wars with your comrades, it does bring people closer together. So for unfortunate reasons, but it is causing many to connect in ultimately very human levels, because there are human implications of many of those discussions going on around the world.
To that point, and actually hearkening also back to what Beth said a minute ago about, people seeing kind of life going on behind employees who may be in front of a screen. I'm curious if you think it's becoming more socially acceptable to see that sort of blend of work and life, and also if you think that there is a trend towards even more blending of work and life versus work and life balance.
Yeah, look, I think acceptable is in the eye of the beholder. What we try to guide people towards is being productive and, recognizing that there is life happening. Sometimes you see a glimpse of life, you're not actually truly seeing somebody's life. You may have seen a baby come in or out of a scene, but what you don't hear is the 8 hours of wailing that was occurring in the background leading up to it, that set the mind for that person on the call in a very different state than had they been in the office for 8 hours leading up to that call. So, there's a bit of a surface level of, I think, what we are seeing happening in people's lives, so to speak. In terms of the, what is acceptable, I think there's still an element of you're in a professional environment, you're being requested to be productive. That does not necessitate a 9 to 5 setting naturally. And frankly, that hasn't been the case for, my entire career. So, I think there is accommodation, but there is a balance. And that's where probably more than anything, we are seeing judgment. And what I have commented on earlier, where you see some cracks in the armor of different leaders or different organizations, you will see those cracks be exacerbated. If somebody typically exhibits poor judgment, they probably continue to do it in an exacerbated way. The magnifying lens on certain parts of organizations, on CEOs, on boards. I mean, CHROs have never been at the highlight of this more than others, and Beth and many have navigated it beautifully. But when it breaks, you see it much more immediately, and you still have to remember that there is an organization that you are moving forward, and it's not your personal playground, and you've got to solve for some of the issues. I think there's been an incredible amount of empathy during this period of uncertainty, and the question is, and for how long? So what if a vaccine is put in place? What if there is some more return to normalcy, whether it's 12, 18, 24 months from now? What if the market sort of comes back, or when it comes back? And then will you have the same empathy for those individuals in those environments? And so judgment, I think, is the fundamental word here, and leaders still need to provide leadership and guidance when they see lack of judgment.
Thank you. What you said about the eventual, kind of return to normalcy, whenever that may happen, shifting gears a bit, Beth, as you think about the return to work, because that is something that a lot of companies are beginning to talk about and they're in the middle of planning for, what are the things that human resources executives should be thinking about when they begin to reintegrate people either back to the office or in other public spaces?
Yeah, so I think a few things. I think the language that we like to use is return to the office, because I know our people are working, and I know many people talk about return to work, and it's not a criticism, but I do think words matter, and so so being really clear about return to the office, I think. For most employers, you're going to be dealing with a couple of things. You're going to be dealing with the needs of your workforce, the fears of your workforce, circumstances outside of their control, and government regulations. And so you may desire people back into a workforce, but you may be limited by your state, federal, country, city government to only be able to occupy 10% of your building, 20% of your building, 30% of your building. And so, redesigning workspaces so employees know that their safety is top of mind, making things visible, cleaning people during the day, honestly, the smell of disinfectant in the air, the availability of PPE, and then a real question around if still 75% of your workforce is remote, which by design will require that companies adopt a remote-first culture always. And I think of going back into our office, even if I was to go back to my desk tomorrow, I'd go to a place where our conference rooms would be closed, because we once going to sit in closed space, even if you can socially distance, where only a fraction of the workforce would be there, and then I'd have to wear a mask most of the time if I was moving outside of my office. And I think we really have to ask ourselves, how worthwhile is that right now as we return? And if it is worthwhile, and there are many places where it is worthwhile, how do you still honor that remote first culture and not make your people who can't get there, are afraid to get there, or have physical, medical reasons why they shouldn't be there, or people in their family have those concerns, that they don't then feel like second-class citizens, that there's not this sort of badge of honor that you've come back to the office and you've braved this. And I think, listen, there are some real considerations, like employees saying, "Oh, I'm perfectly fine being in the office, but I'm not getting on the subway."
Yeah.
I would add one other thing, which is, the motivation of employees and through some of the surveying and keeping that pulse check open. If you think about some fundamental dynamics that are happening in the course of any recession, You have a completely different, sort of all of a sudden stock. What is it worth? If you look at sort of pay and equity and things that may have been drivers for some. In the technology sector, you have many companies that have only ever been in their entire history up and to the right. And they are now having to stagnate IPOs. They've done layoffs for the first time ever. The resiliency of these organizations, I think, will be tested in many different ways. And certainly other industries have gone through this, and even the technology sector over decades has gone through it. But there are so many new and high growth unicorn type companies that we do believe there will be additional types of leadership that are going to be required coming out of this to complement the existing organization. How do you motivate and how do you think about this holistically? And those types of leaders, will be in demand, in the months, and we're already seeing that start to come to fruition in the conversations we're having.
Thank you so much. We're just about out of time, but I want to thank you, Beth, and also you, Nada, for a fantastic discussion about the response and the future of the workplace. Thank you again so much.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks, Beth.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks, Nada.